Good morning. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this virtual program with California Senate President Pro Tem Toni Atkins. This event is part of PPIC's 2020 Speaker Series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We would like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. The series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor so that we may continue to make programs like today's possible. More information is available at ppic.org. Before we begin, if you have a question for Senator Atkins, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. Today's program comes at an unparalleled time for the state, many challenges for the state and the nation. We're so pleased to have the Senate President Pro Tem here to talk about these challenges. Senator Toni Atkins, who represents parts of San Diego, was elected by her colleagues to be President Pro Tem of the State Senate in 2018. Before her election to the Senate in 2016, Senator Atkins also served 6 terms in the Assembly, where her colleagues selected her to be the Speaker in 2014. Thank you so much for being here today, Senator Atkins.
It's good to be here with you, Mark. Thank you.
And we haven't had a chance to have a conversation like this for a while, and much has happened since you became Senate Pro Tem. I'm going to start by two areas of focus that Californians say are their top 2 issues in PPIC statewide surveys today: COVID-19 and the economy. So my first question is, from your vantage point, where is California in terms of managing the pandemic? And what are the key challenges for the state over the next 3 months?
Right. Well, those are the $100 million questions, right? I think California obviously got off to a very strong start in terms of containing and trying to control the virus. Of course, we're a huge state, and I have to say from the very beginning, about mid-March, the world looked great until about mid-March, and we had a hearing, of course, in the Capitol before the Assembly and the Senate recessed. And before we recessed, we were able to make sure that the governor had the resources. We put money towards schools, additional money to schools, most vulnerable populations, homelessness, housing, money to the communities to help them as they begin to try to figure out what to do around the pandemic and their most vulnerable people. We went home to our districts, and I would say if I were to highlight any particular thing, it was the governor's work with the healthcare infrastructure, the hospital association, to talk about and make sure that we had an appropriate number of ICU beds, to start to get PPE, the safety equipment. All of that was extraordinary in terms of California's quick action, quicker than almost anywhere else in the country. And of course, you know, we still have issues to make sure that we have enough PPE. I know the schools have about a 2-month supply. That's not enough. If we're to look at this long term, we've got to make sure we have a bigger supply. I think we've started to see just today, yesterday, in the last few days, the hospitalizations go down, ICU go down. That trends well for the next couple of weeks. This next couple of weeks is going to be really important. I would say our biggest challenge. So while I think we rose to the occasion And I give a lot of credit to the governor and his administration for the quick action around the infrastructure, the health and the hospital infrastructure. And clearly, the hospitals were incredible to step forward, to be ready to address this issue. But where we are now in terms of the high volume of numbers, keeping up with the testing, the trace and contact, having enough of the equipment, actually, the reagents and the testing to be able to do this has been a problem. My own county of San Diego has now started to have difficulty in their supply of those things. So I think we did well in the beginning. I think it really is, how are we going to continue to make sure we have PPE? How do we have those medical supplies to do the testing? What do we do to bring those numbers down? And it all starts with one simple thing. Well, two maybe. Wearing a mask, all of us. Personal responsibility, because those of us who have the ability to take those precautions are going to help the most vulnerable people, our grocery workers, our warehouse workers, the essential workers that have to be on the front lines doing the job. And then, of course, I think, it really is making sure that we are constantly in contact with healthcare workers, with the vulnerable communities, and that we are trying to make sure we keep the stock of supplies. So I think we, in all honesty, we've lost some ground, but I do think we know what we need to do to continue to try to turn this around. And the biggest thing we can do is not be out and about if we don't have to be. Continue to work remotely, wear the mask, make sure you're encouraging your friends and family to do that as well. I know we all want to get back out there. We're getting impatient, we're anxious, but if we don't have to, if we're not the essential worker, then we need to support the essential worker. But we still have a ways to go. But happy with our beginning. Need to stay focused on making sure that we're supplying the PPE and have the supplies we need going forward.
Thank you. So some lawmakers and other members of the legislative community were diagnosed with COVID-19. I'm just wondering, what's this been like for you as a legislative leader in navigating the situation and getting the legislature to work on the business at hand?
Right. Well, I got to give a lot of credit to my caucus, the senators and a Republican leader, Shannon Grove. We've been in constant contact since March. We had multiple calls weekly with my caucus. I was in communication with Shannon. We've been at work since the first recess. We started an economic working group led by Senator Hertzberg and Bradford. We started working, have our own proposal on the tenant landlord issue. Everybody's very concerned about that from the federal level. Obviously, the judicial branch and the Chief Justice, the Legislature. But I think the hard thing was really wanting to be engaged and to be where we think we're supposed to be, which is the Capitol. And we spent months not here, but we have found ways to work. I will say it's been a challenge, as if we didn't think the end of session last year was a challenge for the Senate with, someone throwing blood and hazardous materials into our chamber, having to carve up the chamber and put up plexiglass for our vulnerable members, having to figure out how to communicate with the public and to make sure there is public access. And so one interesting thing, Mark, while the public is less able to come into the building and we're controlling that, the ability for people to actually call in on legislation, I'm noticing we're getting more calls from all over the state for people who can't be here. So there's the positive aspect of public participation, and then there's the challenge of people not being able to come into their capital the way they used to. And then, of course, members having to cull bill loads because we don't have the space or the time to hear every piece of legislation to try to get us to focus. While we let the science lead us on the virus and the pandemic, politics is an art form. It's not really a science, although I know I graduated with a degree in political science, but in many respects, it's more of an art form. And when I look at my colleagues, some who are terming out, this is their last chance to do some legislation. So it has been a challenge, but I have to say my colleagues have been really, my Senate colleagues have been really great about it.
I was going to ask you, so a new wrinkle in the legislative process is voting remotely. And I wonder if you could just give us a sense of how that's going from your perspective.
Well, we thought about that. Fortunately, I have incredible advisors and staff from Ledge Council to my of council, and gosh knows we have a lot of attorneys in the legislature who like to weigh in on this. But we got an opinion that we could look at the possibility of voting remotely. And so we prepared for that, the eventuality that we might not be able to return to the Capitol even in March. So we put into our rules the ability to vet that further. We have not yet voted remotely, but as we come back into full session to consider bills, we are considering that very thing. I have to be concerned about my vulnerable senators who are here to represent their constituents. And their voice can be heard. And as long as we follow some fairly strict criteria and guidelines to ensure the public feels good about open government and their legislators being able to participate, we fully anticipate we will be using that ability. I'm sure the framers of the Constitution didn't anticipate we would have the technology as well as the ability to hold ourselves accountable and do this. So I fully anticipate we will go there at some point, particularly as session winds down.
Yeah, and probably didn't have in mind that there'd be a pandemic also. But before we leave this topic and talk about the economy, I wonder if you could give our viewers today a sense of where the legislature fits in the struggle to contain the pandemic. We hear from the governor almost every day. We hear from the White House. What's the role of the state legislature?
Well, I think obviously a federal administration, a president's comments, a governor's comments are going to be louder than a senator from San Diego, maybe. But I would say our voices have been present the whole time. From our special budget committee, the budget committee, the joint legislative budget committee has the ability to review what the governor's office and the administration is doing. We've been pretty vocal about that. We want to make sure that we're doing our job, our responsibility, and advocating on behalf of our constituents. I think you see us all over our districts delivering food. I was there in San Diego when the convention center turned itself into the place where we could have homeless individuals, where there was triage and county presence to do the testing and provide all that. I would say we have been very vocal, very visible, but we know what our role is, and we have a role in terms of oversight, budget monitoring, legislation, and also being visible and present in our communities. And I think we've done that.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. Let's move on to talk about the economy. As you're well aware, there have been job losses from the pandemic across all sectors of the economy, across geography, have particularly hit hard on communities of color in California. What do you think is the most important thing for the state to do to try to address some of the damage that's taken place in the economy?
Well, it's such a hard thing to realize that you've worked your way back from a decade of recession, created a $22 billion reserve or surplus, only to find yourselves looking at an $8 billion deficit next year. We worked on the budget this year. We could have $8 billion next year. I think we, our focus, clearly we need our federal partners to continue to look at the issues as it relates to individual workers, unemployment insurance and benefits, pandemic benefits. I think the focus on business, small business in particular, I think we've got to continue to do what we're doing on making sure that the PPE is available to as many people as possible, as many industries as possible, as many, across the economic spectrum. And I think that's key. I think we've got to invest in small businesses and business. We've done tax deferrals, a lot of things that we could think about and do, we have done, making sure schools stay whole in terms of how we fund schools and the tax funding of schools. But we have got to focus our economic recovery on how we support the businesses that are able to continue to exist. Clearly, tourism, our restaurant industry is in dire straits. They have adjusted to try to figure out how to open up and do so safely. We now see sidewalk cafes into the street, something that cities and jurisdictions were not excited about in terms of other issues are now opening up. But I think our economic recovery has got to focus on small businesses, individuals who have gotten left out of the economic recovery. We've got to make sure that is our focus, and which is why the economic recovery plan that we have really focuses on small businesses.
So let's talk about economic recovery. Katie Pettibone from the Valencia Government Relations asked this question. So we'll try to intersperse some audience questions. Make sure we get to some here. What will be some policies that California will, should, could implement to rebuild the economy, get people back to work as the state comes out of the pandemic?
Well, I think, some of what the federal government did, that reached some of our businesses, not enough small businesses, and I understand California didn't do as well as some other states. I think we have to continue to evaluate those businesses that need additional assistance. I mean, let's just be clear, it's affecting everyone. My hairdresser is still in business, but he, has a network of folks, his peer group, a couple have just decided to retire. They've been doing it a long time and given all of the considerations. So we have got to really work with our small business community. And, we need, the economy's got to work for small business. We've got to make sure our corporations have the ability to continue to function. But, we have to evaluate those programs and make sure that if we're doing loans or, the federal program, some of those loans transfer into grants if people have been able to if employers have been able to keep their employees hired. We really have to take a dive in, and I met with some of the businesses in Sacramento. I've got a call with some of my local businesses and restaurants coming up. I think we need to listen to them, tell us what their problematic areas are, and try to work on programs working with our state infrastructure, Office of Small Business, GoBiz, to figure out how we can be helpful. I don't have all the answers, but I know we've got to focus on them as a group and individuals. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. We talk about schools not able to go back into session and distance learning. That's an impact on parents who also have jobs, and maybe many of them can work remotely. What about those who can't? And how do you, so it isn't just small business. We have to be sure to look at individuals in terms of the assistance we're providing. Think about it, EDD, $50 billion in the last several weeks has gone out in terms of unemployment insurance and pandemic insurance. When 2008, 2009 happened, we were at $500 million for that economic downturn. $500 million. So 50 billion compared to $500 million. We really do have our work cut out for us, but which is why we have to come up with an economic recovery plan that we can buy into. And I hope we can do that in the next couple of weeks. Looking forward to hearing the governor's economic recovery plan. Hopefully what we're doing will dovetail with what they're going to propose. We've gotten a lot of positive reaction from the financial markets that our proposal actually is workable and something they would like to see.
Here's another question that came in that's related to economic conditions. What about farm labor? What can the state do to support the critical workers behind our food system?
Well, I mean, that really is, and when we talk about the critical essential workers and PPE and where we're making it possible for um, testing to be readily available and the healthcare access right there and available to the workers, and that gets to the employers too. There have got to be guidelines, criteria that actually support the employer, but also with the benefit being the health of the workers. And so all of those focuses, when we talk about a commitment of $50 million to Central Valley, we all know that's quickly become, and largely because of the farm worker and the essential workers there in the warehouses and the fields, that we've got to provide support structures for them. How do they get to work? You know, how are they able to get to work? Are they in big vans of people who are not uh, practicing or able to practice safe practices? We've got to find ways to support the industry in ways that we have not. So when the governor talks about a commitment, I think we need to know what are the details about that. How are we supporting those families? They're going to work, be exposed, and go home to their families. You know, we do have work to do there, and I think we have to consider every piece of it, not just once they get to work, how do we protect them? How do they start their day? How do they then go home? What access to services do they have every part of that day? We've got to up that times 10. And, you know, I know that's a focus of the administration, and we need to be supportive.
So we touched upon the issue that there have been health effects and job impacts that of the pandemic that have had an outsized impact on low-income Californians and communities of color. At the same time, since the end of May, the horrific death of George Floyd, which people watched and reacted to with protest and frustration, many communities across California and nationally are directly confronting what have been longstanding racial disparities and injustice. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the state level leadership that can be provided in this area, and specifically, what might we expect from this session in terms of police misconduct bills?
Well, thank you. Obviously, 2 years ago, we were busy looking at Dr. Weber's AB 392, the use of force, and it was probably one of the biggest pieces of legislation to come out of any legislature in the country. And there had been a conversation that was starting about, you know, how other states could follow that lead. Well, the unfortunate situation with George Floyd really highlighted systemic racism and how it really brought it to the forefront in a way that I don't think we've seen. I don't think we've seen. And so we have a unique opportunity, and there's quite a number of pieces of legislation. In fact, I think we have public safety happening today, and a number of bills coming from the Assembly and the Senate. And I would say, you know, it is absolutely something we need to do. And of course, we're doing all of this in a truncated legislative session. But I do think we have a lot of information and a lot of desire to see this be the start of reform and social justice in a way. I mean, let's be clear. Prior to George Floyd and the protests that ensued, I'm not sure ACA 5 and ACA 6, you know, there was large discussion, to be completely honest. Would those things have made it out of the legislature?
Yeah.
Maybe, because that happens. You know, we were able to get the use of force bill 2 years ago, but I think it brought into light a whole new realm of awareness. And I hope, much like culture change that needs to happen, I think it gives us the opportunity to go further than we might have gone originally. But what's got to be at the root of all that is real awareness and real culture shift. And I think that's what our colleagues are, who, you know, our colleagues of color, our African-American colleagues and friends and family are concerned about, that it will be one more moment where we address it for now and then next year, what happens? And
Right.
so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to realize this is our moment to be able to make that kind of change.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to listen, and I want to be able to be supportive, and I think we can get some good things done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Something that's very much on the minds of Californians. You touched upon it earlier when you talked about the fact that many schools are not opening for classes, and they're going distance learning. But from your vantage point as a leader in the state legislature, how confident are you that the schools are ready to begin teaching again this year?
Well, I think teachers want to be able to teach. I was just listening to the news here locally last night, and hearing a couple of teachers say, we want to do our jobs, but we also have to be home with our families, and we don't want to bring that risk home. So I think, we've talked again and again about the criteria for how to do distance learning, how to be supportive at this time. And I think we have to continue to try to determine how we're going to do that safely for the kids, for our students, how we're going to do that safely for the very teachers we're counting on to do the job. They want to be in the classroom with their kids, but we have got to continue to find ways to support education. And, we already were being tasked with trying to figure out how to provide more resources for education. Prop 98 provides a floor, not a ceiling. And we had just been able to look at how we could provide more resources. Now we're going to have to find a way to do even more so that distance learning isn't the bare minimum, because our kids need to be educated, and losing this valuable time, we need to be prepared to go. So those guidelines have to be in place. They have to be supported by the very people who we are expecting to teach our kids. And at the same time, we've got to make sure we have the funding to do it right. We've got to make sure they have the PPE in place, and that they're not going to run short. They don't need that extra burden, of are we going to have enough of a supply? Right. So I think education, if we talk about economic recovery, economic recovery is all about continuing to be able to provide education, higher education. All of our UC-CSU, I've talked to the new president coming into our UC system. I consistently talk with the chancellor at CSU, and I talked to some of our private presidents yesterday at USD and Point Loma Nazarene. And they're giving us information about what they need in order to be able to do their job and to continue to educate at higher education. So we're going to have to look at funding. We're going to have to look at making sure they have access to resources as well. And testing. The schools are trying to, particularly higher education, they're trying to figure out how to control their realm and their world around testing. So the supply, it gets back to the supply chain on all of that. So one thing I would say, Mark, clearly you can see we're getting a lot of information about what the needs are. And we have to constantly be having that conversation with the administration and making sure that we prioritize our limited now budget resources to do that in the right way.
One thing that I hear when I talk to both people at the K-12 level, but also in higher education, is the importance of increasing access to broadband, which as you look at what we're doing here today, we're using broadband. But for distance learning to be successful, either for K-12 or higher education, people have to have access to broadband. And what might the state be able to do in that realm so that it's closer to 100% than it is today?
Right. Well, I guess there's nothing like a crisis to force us to do something faster than we needed to do, or faster than we were going to do, I might add. This has been a message coming out of our rural communities for quite a few years. I think of my good friend Joy Sterling in Sonoma, who represents a lot of the rural businesses, and this has been her mantra for the last several years. It's part of the governor's economic Recovery Task Force, Broadband. It's part of the discussion in the legislature. It's part of the, how are we going to provide access? It's our partnership with the telecommunications and the various platforms. So, I will say this, I do believe this pandemic and this crisis is going to push us to get that network and that infrastructure in place much quicker. And I have talked recently with the CEO of AT&T and numerous others. We are in communication about what they're doing. They want us to know how they're stepping up and what they're trying to do to be part of the solution. But the state really does need to pay close attention, and through our PUC, how are we moving this forward quicker, faster, better? I got to tell you, I've learned more skills than I ever had before. From my first Zoom call to today, I think it's a good thing that we are pushing ourselves, but it is something I think we will see is going to take us further than we would have been a few years from now.
Yeah, thank you. So the legislative calendar, we talked about this before the program started. You have 20-something days left, and lots of issues that are in bills. And I'm just wondering about, if you could give us a roadmap for what the rest of the legislative year looks like, which we can count in days at this point, not months.
Right. Well, a truncated session is really hard because, we're dealing with a lot of complicated topics and, COVID related use of force, reform in that area. All of those things would typically go through 1, 2, 3 committees, and many of them are going through one committee. And you've got one committee hearing. We've found ways to add a few committee hearings. But, one of the conversations I had with my caucus and with Republican leader Grove was every member has got to understand if a piece of legislation is coming through one committee, you got to do the work of 1, 2, or 3 committees in terms of your analysis. And we've let our consultants know. But I would say, big issues are still big issues. Housing was an issue prior to our recess in March that changed our whole direction of how we were going to work this year. Housing, production, affordability, all of the issues around that are still high on the priority list, both I know in the Assembly and the Senate. Obviously, wildfire protection and issues still around how we're proceeding on that. The economic recovery, anything we can do on that. We have, in addition to our economic recovery working group, I put together a pandemic, emergency pandemic working group that was sort of separate from what we were already doing to kind of highlight issues around assisted living facilities, CDCR in prisons, testing, PPE, all of that. And so we've seen legislation come out from that working group. Those issues don't change, but some bills got put on a shelf. Obviously, we look forward to 2021 to have a discussion about those issues. But I think housing is a big one, continuing to make sure we have healthcare access and what we're doing around the pandemic.
Thank you. There's another question that came in, this one on rent and deferred rent. So housing related, how will tenants pay the deferred rent if you don't have enough money to pay, for example, $20,000? Is there a bill in the legislature on this topic?
Well, there's a couple of bills. David Chu has a bill that is in our House right now that talks about rent relief and addresses also a mortgage piece for individuals and deferred mortgage payments. The Senate also has a piece of legislation. Clearly, we were trying to number one, flatten the economic curve in addition to the COVID curve in a way that spreads out the obligations and what we have to do over a period of time so that people would be able to pay their rent in a way that they would be able to do. In addition, trying to recognize our piece of legislation tries to find a balance between tenants and landlords, because not all landlords are mega corporations with, with the intent to just make profit. Some of them, these are investment properties for people, and it's their only form of, their retirement, and their margins are thin. So we were trying to find a way to balance it over time. Clearly, I'm not sure either side thinks it's the best solution, because it's not enough for either side. But we are trying to find a balanced approach to give people a long enough time to make those payments back if they're the tenant, trying to support the small landlords in particular. And of the bigger landlords, some of those are nonprofits that provide affordable housing and subsidized units to people. Those property owners, those nonprofits, don't want to lose their tenants. They're there to provide affordable housing. So there are two pieces of legislation. Gosh, help me to remember the numbers of bills. I can't even remember my own bill numbers. But David Chu has a significant piece of legislation. We have a piece of legislation that's being carried by Senator Bradford, and also Ana Caballero, that's in the other house. So we are trying to address it. Obviously, it's a concern to everybody. It's part of the federal package in terms of what you can do to help tenants in terms of the rents issue. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is involved. Local jurisdictions are extended moratoriums. So I think we're all engaged in this discussion, and there will be continued relief. The issue will be in what manner and at what levels and over what period of time will people have to pay back, or will those become grants at some point? And if that's true, then there has to be the subsidy to provide for the grant, so that you're paying attention to both the tenant and particularly landlords that have smaller portfolios or properties.
Thank you. I should probably ask you about homelessness also, because when we started the year, for the first time in the history of the statewide survey of PPIC, homelessness was named as the issue that Californians most wanted the governor and legislature to work on this year. Earlier in our speaker series program, we had the co-chairs of the homelessness task force on here to talk about what progress had been made. There's, I think, a lot of concerns, valid ones, that this pandemic is going to make homelessness worse, and certainly more complicated. I know in San Diego, there's been a lot of progress made on homelessness, but a lot of other places in the state, not so much. And I'd like to get a sense of what this legislature, what you're thinking about in the legislature right now about what could be done.
Well, it's a huge issue. I mean, one of our priorities during the budget conversation was not to reduce the amount of money. And while it took a little bit of a haircut, we still wanted money going to the local jurisdictions. I come out of local government, and I believe very much that there is no one size fits all for how to address what's working in one community versus another. Thank you for saying San Diego's made headway. I would say yes, but not nearly enough if we've got people still living on the streets, particularly during a pandemic. So I think our county wanted to take advantage of this opportunity that we were able to get people at our convention center with some triage capability for all kinds of things, not just COVID-19 and testing, and but for triaging for housing that we could have. This opportunity to turn some motels into transitional housing, potentially maybe reevaluate whether those buildings were able to be rehabilitated to provide quality, affordable, lower income housing. I think that is going to take resources. It's going to take resources in addition to working with counties and the types of programs that they're using. And so obviously, again, in March, my colleagues in the Assembly and in the Senate had a lot of ideas for how to continue to work to try to tackle homelessness. You still see some legislation coming forward that talks about mental health issues. It's got to be tied to what you're doing around mental health as well. So I think You know, this is part of the production. They're all aligned and related. We've got to produce more housing. We've got, and by the way, I think we need to look at emerging opportunities. If we really are going to lose business spaces, or people start to work more remotely and become very comfortable with that to the degree, you're going to have, much like a bill that Ana Caballero has about retail space and how you can turn that into housing or make it available for zoning for mixed use retail housing, how you turn some of that into housing. There may be opportunities that we may need to look at. We've got money going into housing. We just need to target it more efficiently in terms of the opportunities that might exist now.
Very interesting. Might think about housing differently as after the pandemic in terms of what happens to working remotely and where jobs are located. Here's a question that came in from Dan Carrick, Senior Policy Advisor of the Renee Public Policy Group. I'm not going to read all of it because it's a very long.
I read it on the chat side.
Okay, so I'll give people a summary and say about this. Basically, you carried legislation in the past. Now most cities today are good housing actors. They've updated state-approved housing plans. So then why is it okay to have several pending bills in the 2020 session, including bills by Senator Wiener and yourself, overriding local zoning and general plans in these good actor communities? Why not reward good actors by exempting those with state-certified housing elements? It's maybe complicated for everybody who's listening, and maybe you can unpack that for us.
It's a local control question, I think, in terms of zoning, and there are good actors. There are cities that are very much focused on providing affordable housing and work towards production. It's true. We have more than 450 cities in the state of California, 58 counties, and I think we should reward good actors. And actually, we had a lot of conversation about resources and infrastructure funding for good actors to reward that behavior when they're building infill housing and things of that nature. That sort of went by the wayside, that there was legislation to talk about infrastructure. It was part of our discussion around our production package that we wanted to incentivize cities, but we also wanted to reward good actors. I would say the legislation that you see, particularly some of the bills in our House, whether it's 995, I do remember these numbers, 995 and 1120, those were two critical bills, in addition to Ana Caballero's 1385, I think, 1385. Those packages of bills, particularly 1120, and recognize local control and local zoning. What we are saying is you do need to allow for densification, and some of that can be done in single-family neighborhoods, but only if you allow a lot split and you respect local zoning as it relates to setbacks, other criteria. So it was very much done in mind with feedback from the League of Cities and cities. Now, having said that, Mark, housing is complex. Yes. You know, there are many stakeholders, from issues around CEQA, affordability, local control and zoning. And I would just say on any given day, we met with all of these stakeholders, equity groups, labor, and they all have a different lens and a different perspective from which to look through it. It makes it nearly impossible to find a piece of legislation that everybody would support. So we tried to stay focused on production. And the affordable folks are saying, well, you need to do affordability. Well, we've got affordability in 995, 15%, which is the highest that the state has done. We want to respect local inclusionary zoning. You know, we could have a whole session on housing, but you know, we're trying to balance all of the issues and come to the point where we actually are focused on production. I've spent my career focused on affordability and making sure there are resources and money going to build subsidized housing. Production is a key piece of this too. And if you want to drive prices down, at some point, you got to have enough stock to help do that. So it's all of those things. Yeah. And we've got something that everybody will love. Well, we've got something that people can love, and we've got something that a lot of people can hate.
Thank you. So you've been a speaker, you're Senate president now. Can you give us a sense about, at this point in time, the speaker, the governor, Senate president, the Republican leader of Assembly and Senate, how are you all working together during this crisis?
Well, I mean, I think we all have our different challenges. The Assembly and the Senate, bicameral, we worked incredibly well together on the budget. We both are looking very hard at this economic recovery proposal that we have. It's become a bicameral joint proposal. But the speaker and I have different houses. We have different considerations and different issues. He certainly has more members to deal with.
Yeah.
And work for than I do. The governor obviously has a different responsibility. He is the executive. We are the legislative branch. But I've had plenty of great conversations with the governor to talk about our proposals, the budget. The speaker and I talk regularly. Shannon Grove and I communicate all the time. And, I would even say Marie Waldron, who is from Escondido, the Republican leader, I mean, she's from my county. We are the same delegation. So I think we communicate well. We just all have different obligations and different responsibilities. And, the Assembly is a bigger house than the Senate.
Yeah. So many bills and so little time. How do you prioritize, and how do you keep everyone just focused on the here and now, what needs to be done this month, and what can wait till next year? How do you think about what can wait till, or will have to wait till next year? Because as you said, it's too complicated. It should go through 3 committees, not 1.
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. What I said earlier about, politics being an art form, not necessarily a science. My caucus and I talked for months, March, April, heading back into May when we came back into session. And, they actually reduced their bill load significantly based on my telling them that we don't know if we'll go back into session and get to stay in session, or whether we had no way to predict the situation in the pandemic. So we culled our bill loads. I said we should try and put it through a lens of COVID and some of our key priorities. But, we also have members who are termed out who've been working on legislation their entire careers, and their bill might necessarily not have looked to be COVID related. We had a whole wildfire package of bills, many of which are not moving forward now. And I would consider those priorities. I think it was just a process of constant communication with each other. I would say that's the key that we used in the Senate, was constant communication about what we would do and how we would support each other. And a number of my colleagues said, I will put these bills on a shelf, recognizing that some of our senators are termed out. And I thought that was a really, wonderful thing for them to do. But, people get to present their bills and they get to submit their bills, and we're all elected officials accountable to our constituents. So we did the best we could.
Thank you. Speaking of our constituents, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that if you have a question, send it to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. You mentioned wildfires, and just because we have one disaster going on doesn't mean that we're exempt from having another one. And can you give us a sense of the work that's been done in the legislature the last year, and your sense of our level of preparedness for this fire season?
Well, I think, we did a lot in the last 2 budget cycles. As Governor Brown was in his last year, we clearly saw that the wildfire danger was increasing. Climate change, conditions, certainly that started under Governor Brown and continued under Governor Newsom. And the legislature for the last several years has had a package of pieces of legislation, everything from, of course, looking at our utilities and and their responsibility, obviously PG&E and issues around the bankruptcy, issues with the PUC and how they will work, how we have oversight and what our role will be, not losing the role that we want to have as a legislator for accountability and oversight, working with the governor on, I mean, from almost day one of his coming into office, he has had to address those issues. We still have legislation that's coming, but I think the biggest piece was the budget actions in the last several years to really shore up our equipment throughout the state, how to support local fire departments, CAL FIRE, all of that really critical. The work you do around the environment, the hardening, all of that has been part of legislation as well as budget actions. Having said that, I know that we have a fire going right now in Southern California. And I got the notice this morning in terms of how much contained. And so we still have to be concerned about the issue, and because a pandemic doesn't take away the danger from fire prevention and safety. So we're still focused on that, and we have more work to do.
So you mentioned the state budget, and I wonder if you can give us a sense of what kind of shape you think California is in terms of our state budget when we think about our legislature. And by we, I mean the people of California. We tend to think first and foremost about the people who pass the budget and make sure that there's money for local government, local services, and things that we need. What's your sense of where we are with the state budget right now?
Well, I feel very good about the budget that we passed. And I do applaud the fact that our federal partners did a number of stimulus programs. We are counting on this next one for education in particular, to support local government. All of our local governments have budgets that they have to realize too. And so that next stimulus is really important. Having said that, if you look at our July returns, our incoming corporate taxes came in at about 2.3 billion ahead of projections. So we don't have data on sales tax yet, but we look heavily at incoming corporate tax revenue. We ended our fiscal year in June about 1 billion ahead of our projections, and those are all our new projections. Now, if there's any good news to take from that, it gives us a sense of hope about what recovery could look like moving forward based on these revenues. Having said that, just because we come in at 2.3 billion ahead, it doesn't mean we need to spend that money, because next year we are projected to have an $8 billion deficit. So if there's good news, it's that if we're coming in ahead, it gives us a better starting point than we thought we would be at. If we're able to count on stimulus resources to support our state and local government, that clearly will help us on all of those issues we spent the whole hour talking about, from education to healthcare to PPE, etc.
Right. What are your thoughts about new taxes? There's talk about a millionaire's tax, for instance. I don't know if there are discussions around tax reform now, but that's, of course, the other side of the equation, along with spending, that people are always interested in.
It's always a conversation and discussion, Mark, as you know. You poll on this stuff all the time. It's always a consideration and a conversation. I think part of what we were trying to do when we did our economic package, our economic recovery package out of the Senate side, was how do we do this without raising taxes on middle income Californians? And so it does leave the question out there. I think a lot of that is going to depend on where we end up with this stimulus right now from the federal government. Obviously, we have to look at something long-term, because if you look at our education budget long-term, we still have issues there. Even if a ballot measure passes that really supports, there's the ballot measure, schools and communities first. If that passes, that will help our education budget. And so I hope, but of course it's always a consideration. We look at it constantly in terms of when is the right time to do that? How would it look? What is the formula going forward? And, it's a possibility. There's a whole discussion right now from stakeholders out there, nonprofit groups, school groups, labor groups. I mean, it's a pretty big coalition of folks that are saying we need to look at this now. That's a discussion.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the split roll measure, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. We've got an election coming up in 3 months, and Californians are going to be asked to weigh in on a lot of ballot measures. Which ones are you watching the most closely?
Well, I certainly am thrilled. We mentioned earlier, let me see, I have to have a list. We have so many.
Yes.
I think, Proposition 16, the affirmative action proposition. I, of course, also am looking at Proposition, oh golly, Proposition 17, that was the ACA 6 that we talked about. I talked about schools and communities first. Well, we've also got bail. There's some really big issues on our ballot that I hope people are going to take some time to look at, because we've also got the issues of the stem cell research, which has been something really important, not just for the science aspect, but California in terms of our life sciences and the innovation and technology that supports Mission Bay in the northern part of the state, and of course in where I live in San Diego in terms of the work that they do. I know Proposition 19 I've supported.
So many things on the ballot. Are we ready for a vote by mail election?
Well, I think that's something that we have focused on in the legislature, because we want to make sure, obviously voting by mail, we want the biggest turnout possible. It's very important for our democracy that people vote. And I think we also have to be prepared to have enough safe sites. We just passed a bill the other day that gives a longer range of time for people to be able to vote. We have to make sure that there are safe sites in every county, enough that people are able to cast their vote and make it count. And so I know that we can do it and do it the right way. California can certainly rise to the occasion and make sure that people have access and are able to exercise their right to vote in a safe manner, and they have somewhere they can call and go if they don't understand, or they didn't get their ballot, or they misplaced their ballot. We have to make sure that that's a possibility, and that there's language capability.
So we only have another minute left, and I have a couple of things I wanted to ask your perspective on. Later this month, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Right.
And what does it mean for you as a Senate pro tem?
Well, I consider the right to vote so important. I mean, I was born and raised in a state where it was hard to register to vote. Regular people couldn't take time off work. They had to go down and register to vote. I take it very seriously. And for me, women being more than half the population, except not half of the elected representatives in this country, it's still very meaningful that women are represented all across the spectrum. And I've been fortunate to be the speaker and the pro tem, the first woman pro tem, but I wouldn't be here without some incredible role models and mentors and people who helped me as a woman do that. I think of so many incredible legislators, and so it's something to celebrate, and I will be celebrating that.
Thank you. Before we leave, sometimes for all of us, it's hard to think about any positives in these unprecedented, challenging times for the state and the nation. What gives you hope as you think about the rest of 2020?
Well, I think, we are in anxious times. People feel it. My colleagues feel it. I feel it. I said it on the floor yesterday. I think what gives me hope is that, I've seen so many acts of kindness by people, and it inspires me when people step out of their comfort zone to extend themselves for someone else. And even as anxious and as worried as people can be about their own personal situation, their family members who might be struggling and vulnerable, I just hope we cling to the fact that, number one, we have incredible influence and power to do good things. But we should also remember to be kind every day, because someone's counting on that smile. Someone's, even if you can't see you can see it in the eyes. So be kind to people. And remember, they may be struggling more than you are today. So
I'm going to remember that too. Senator Atkins, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Mark, it's always good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, and finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for the event later today, you'll be receiving a survey, and please take a moment to fill it out and let us know how we did. Our next virtual speakers event is next Friday and scheduled to take place at 11 a.m. on Friday the 14th with Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman. Well, thank you again for joining us today, and please be safe and have a good afternoon. Take care.